Welcome back to the Student Hub Live Faculty of Arts and Sciences showcase. And in this session, we're looking at A233, Telling Stories, the Novel and Beyond. It's going to be a fantastic session, and I'm joined by three wonderful guests and a whole host of novels here to talk through. So we've got Jonathan Gibson, Francesca Bianati and Shakewat Tawhid. So could I just ask you to say something about yourselves first and why you're here today?
Well, I'm Jonathan Gibson and I'm the chair of the module. I'm a senior lecturer in English literature.
Brilliant. Francesca?
I'm Francesca Bianati. I'm a research fellow in digital humanities and I'm one of the authors on A233.
Brilliant. Shaf?
Hi, I'm Shaf Tawhid and I'm one of the unit authors on Edith Wharton, novelist I've written on in the past, and I'm very delighted that she's on the module.
Brilliant. Well, I'm excited to have you all here today. Jonathan, I wonder if you could start by giving us an overview then of the module.
The aim of the module is to introduce students to a whole lot of amazing literature, lots of novels and other sorts of narrative. We've divided it into two sections.
Right.
I've brought along all the set texts here. So
Great.
We've got the first half of the module here,
Yeah.
which is realism.
Right.
So these are mainly novels, realist texts attempting to depict the real world, as it were. Second half of the module, the fantastic, is what it says, the opposite of realism. Wonderful sort of magical universes depicted in extraordinary narratives that are not so realist as the narratives in the first half.
OK. Now, we're going to hear in more detail about those two particular themes, but before we do, why would students enjoy studying this module in a general sense, Jonathan?
Well, again, I'd point at the books, and I'd say these are all terrific stories, terrific texts that students will enjoy studying. I'd also say that they will enjoy finding out more. This is a module for people who love reading books, love reading novels, poems, but want to find out more how they're put together, the nuts and bolts, exploring all the details behind the construction of the novels, finding out about the authors, thinking about their own reactions, developing their ideas about the texts, that sort of thing. Now,
you've mentioned the word novels, but the title of the module is Telling Stories, the Novel and Beyond. So yeah. What's the beyond bit?
The beyond, well, the first half of the module, the realism part of the module, as I said, is largely novels, 19th century, 20th century novels, with the fantastic, as well as moving into this fantastic fairy tale sort of phantasmagorical realm. We're also moving slightly beyond the genre of the novel into some poetic texts, a play, and an illustrated novel, all sorts of different things, as well as more novels.
Wow, excellent. OK. So you talked about the structure then. So you've got these sort of two parts. Are they broadly split in equal proportions then? Pretty much, yes. Yeah. OK. And there are two books in terms of teaching material. So students are going to be reading all of... It's a lot of work, isn't it? It's a lot of reading.
We have fewer... Maybe I shouldn't be saying this. We have fewer set texts on this module than on some other English modules. And the reason for that is we really want students to go deep into the books, to really live with them, think about them, enjoy them, get to grips with them thoroughly.
And how wonderful to be actually reading while you're studying, because most often those are the things that get shelved when we're studying, is these wonderful novels. But you've got these set texts as well, which contain everything together.
So, well, we've got these module books. So the first one on realism, second one on the fantastic.
Great.
Looking fantastic, both of
them,
I
are,
think.
indeed.
Those are chapters where Shaf and Francesca and other colleagues of mine go into detail about the particular set texts, help the students through their encounter with them. This is then complemented by online material. In fact, what you will do if you do the module is start from the online material and work through a range of different things, including the readings of the chapters in this book. And there are a whole lot of videos and interactive exercises, online interactive maps and things like that. as
Brilliant.
well.
That sounds great. So this pretty much holds together all of the core reading from the set text that you'll be
That's right,
doing.
yeah.
And how did you then choose all of these? What was the selection process and the criteria that you used for these two categories?
Well, again, this was just great fun. I mean, you know what module meetings are like when you're making an OU module. Well, we actually started, before we decided on this structure of realism and the fantastic, we started with everybody involved in the module. We had a lovely big module
bet it
team.
was my favourite book. And
Choosing books, not simply my favourite book, a book that students would enjoy, a book that would be great for students at this level, and that had all sorts of material that we could use to teach students stuff about literature and how it works. So we had that opening discussion, didn't we, where we were all sort of batting for our own texts, and we ended up with a list. We then thought, now, what sort of structure can we make out of this? We ended up with the realism fantastic split, and then we thought about the texts again and thought, well, this doesn't quite fit, or we want a text of this type now, what can we put in? And eventually, I think we came up with something we're quite happy with. It's an exciting, interesting, intriguing range of texts.
And certainly very varied.
Yes. Well, this was the idea, and it hops around from different period to different period as well, because what you're doing in this module is finding out how literature works, really. You're not looking at a particular historical period and a whole lot of text from that period. You're looking at the nuts and bolts of literature and how it does the amazing things it does for readers.
OK, so let's look at the themes in some detail. So let's look at realism first then, Shaf.
So in the first half of the module, students are introduced to this idea of the realist novel, and they get to study it in some depth. And perhaps I should say that many of us have read realist novels without realising them, because the realist novel tries to represent life as it really is. If you've read a novel by Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, for example, you've actually read a realist novel. And we start off on the module with two novels, which are very much in the realist novel mode. So they start, their first text is Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, and then they move on to Wharton's The Custom of the Country, which is the text I was writing on in terms of the teaching material.
Brilliant. Now, I'd just like to get the results from one of our polls that we asked people about at home, because it may change as we're going through, because you can change your mind. What are you more likely to read, a realistic piece of fiction or a fantastic piece of fiction? And fantastic, we mean fantastical, not our favourite or the best. No. OK, let's see what people at home had to say so far. So, realistic is in the lead at the minute, Shaf, with 80%, fantastic coming through at 20%. Perhaps this is part of our conception of things, though. What do you think?
I think so, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that even though the module is split in two halves, there are sometimes fantastical elements in realist novels and realist elements in fantastical novels. It's always worth bearing that in mind.
But nonetheless, you have a clear divide here. So.
That's right.
But equally important to recognise that crossover. So we've asked for some quotations or some ways of sort of briefly giving a snapshot about how some of these writings are studied.
So, I mean, very famously, George Eliot, a great 19th century novelist, said that realism was about a humble and faithful doctrine, representing life as it really is. So that's the basis in which we might want to think about the realist novel. It has a beginning, a middle and an end. It has well-developed characterisation, and it has a plausible plot. So you can't have things happening in a realist novel that are totally unpredictable or impossible to imagine or represent.
Now, you're not just studying the novels in terms of them being a good read. I mean, they obviously are. But as Jonathan said before, you're looking at different ways of
right.
understanding the novel, and a lot of this is through the course books as well that accompany the set text. So how would you say you could describe a distinguishing feature of narration, for example, which is one of the key things you're looking at in these realistic novels?
That's a very good point to make. And a lot of realist novels have omniscient narrators, so narrators that will have quite a lot of knowledge of what goes on. And then we're slowly introduced into the worlds of the characters through points of view. So you might find, for example, that the narrative shifts from one character's point of view to another, and then the narrator will have comments on that, sometimes ironic, sometimes supportive. So, for example, when you're studying The Custom of the Country, which is the second set text in the realism part, you'll see that the omniscient narrator sometimes makes comments that undercut the points of view of the character that we've just seen in a very sustained and ironic way. So it develops a very complex way of looking at the world, I think, very much like the way in which we interact with the world.
And tell us, you were writing the sections about Edith Wharton as well, and particularly the aspect of storytelling.
That's right. So Edith Wharton is a great favourite of mine. She's a very well-known late 19th and early 20th century American writer. She lived most of her life in Europe, but even before she was a novelist, she liked telling stories, which I think links very nicely to the title of our module. And if I may, I might just quote a little bit from her autobiography, which is called A Backward Glance. And this is when she's a small girl. She's growing up in Paris. Her parents moved around a lot. And she says, "My other Parisian event concerns storytelling, the imagining of tales about grown-up people." And then she says, "I cannot remember the time when I did not want to make up stories. But it was in Paris that I found the necessary formula. Oddly enough, I had no desire to write my stories down, even had I known how to write, and I couldn't yet form a letter. But from the first, I had to have a book in my hand to make up with. And from the first, it had to be a certain type of book. The page had to be closely printed with rather heavy black type and not too much margin." So she's using the book as a sort of prop in order to tell stories. And I think that relationship between the book as a finished object and the telling of stories is everywhere in the module.
Brilliant. Now, we mentioned the crossover before, that I was remissly sort of saying things are very categorical, but there are elements, as you say, of the fantastic and the realistic. Can you give us one example?
Sure. I think all of the novels in the first half of the module have got small elements of the fantastical in them. So, for example, in The Custom of the Country, the lead character, Undine Spragg, she's actually named after a mythical water nymph. So that's a clear way in which Edith Wharton is trying to tell us something about the fantastical past or possibilities about this character. And, for example, the last text you look at in part 1, which is Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, uses the fantastical in much more sophisticated ways. So there are elements of the fantastical in realist novels.
Brilliant. I'd like to go to Francesca next, and we can see some of the various texts here that people will encounter on the module. I mean, how would you define the fantastic then, Francesca?
I think I'll give you the opportunity to listen to one of the set text authors' definitions. So we have 2 short clips from Neil Gaiman.
Okay. Brilliant. So let's look then at these 2, one after the other, and see what Neil Gaiman and how he defines the fantastic.
One of the most important things fantasy is for making metaphors concrete.
Okay, and the next one? We're just going to line that up for us, and then I'm going to...
It's a way of saying we are making imaginary things real so that we can examine them.
OK, so some definitions then. Right. So, and I'd asked Chaff before about defining features of the realistic novel. What would you say is the defining feature then of the fantastic novel?
If the realist novel is set in the real world, the fantastic novel or fantastic text is set in an other world, in a world where the impossible is possible. Like, it could be that there are monsters appearing, or it could be that the laws of physics don't apply anymore. But we, as readers, decide to suspend our belief in science, in rationality, while we're reading the novel.
But there are elements of realism within that, as you say. You know, some things have to hold, even though they're transcended into other contexts.
Usually, the realist element within the fantastic is the kind of questions that the characters have to answer. The example of the text that I wrote about Neil Gaiman and Charles Vess's Stardust, the main character has to answer the question, what am I willing to sacrifice or do in order to achieve my heart's desire? Now, this is a very real question, even if it is set in a world where magic and witches and strange encounters are possible. For example, The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which is a science fiction novel. It's set in a faraway future, but it asks a very real question. Can we build a world that is not based on capitalism? How can it work? So those elements of what the characters go through and what they face are something that we can relate to, even if they happen in a world with starships or witches.
Brilliant. Now, I've got a very broad question to end with for both of you in terms of the actual books, in terms of similarities and differences. And I appreciate that's a very difficult thing to sort of sum up. But what would you say the key thing in terms of the two categories of books? What makes them similar and what makes them so different from each the realistic and the fantastic?
I mean, the realist novels are very interesting in terms of the places and the times in which they're grounded. So, for example, if you're reading The Custom of the Country, it's New York in 1910. It's a specific place and a specific time. And similarly, if you're reading Hardy, it's Wessex in the 19th century. It's a specific place and time. Whereas I think the fantastical texts are much more loosely grounded and range more freely.
And I think because they're set in imaginary locations, then the focus for the reader is on the characters, on the challenges, the quests that they face, rather than on the setting.
Brilliant, excellent. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a fantastic, very quick whistle-stop tour. It looks like a really exciting module. So Jonathan, Francesca and Chef, thank you so much. HJ and Jamin, how's everyone at home?
We're doing really well in the chat. Some great conversations we've been having as well.
Yeah, so a great excitement about this one. So people have been talking about their favourite books, but also how they read books. So overall, people prefer to have a paper solid thing rather than an e-reader. Even down to people seem to absorb the words better off paper rather than off the screen and struggle reading on the screen.
And I think straight after this session, I'm going to have a look at some of the books that were recommended. So Caroline just loves The Picture of Dorian Gray and anything Oscar Wilde. Anna Waters has recommended the book The World According to Garp by John Irvin. And Denise, I agree with this one. Roald Dahl was always a favourite when I was a kid. I love Roald Dahl as well. So I'm off to look at those books. But we'll post the link for the module page in the chat. And it's got all the books as well that you'll be exploring as part of this module. So have a look at that. And that's definitely worth checking out this module.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'm glad that's sparked some interest and conversation. We're going to have two short videos before our next section, and we're going to have a Who's Who with Shaf and a Read It with Francesca, and then we're back with David Scott and Jonathan Brown to talk about DD 105, which is an introduction to criminology. So join me for that next session very soon.